Elon Musk questions the validity of American foreign policy in the Middle East. Meanwhile, Biden refuses even to say the word ceasefire. Let's hope that he hasn't got a hidden agenda for exacerbating conditions in the Middle East. Hello there, you awakening wonders. Thanks for joining us on our voyage to truth and freedom that has become more complex with every passing day. How do we find principles of unification among us? How do we find ways of discussing peace? How do we find ways of sympathizing with people that have lost loved ones to terrorist atrocities while acknowledging that ongoing war is itself a devastating form of terror by another name? How do we together respect the people that are integrally involved in this conflict via nationality or religion, whilst finding ways that the rest of us might be supportive and valuable and provide talking points that lead to something other than more war, more death, more profits for the military-industrial complex? Oh, well, let's not talk about things that don't lead to profits for the military-industrial complex. Elon Musk has put his head above the parapet, saying that by continuing to bomb Gaza and to try to exterminate Hamas, you will likely generate future terrorism. Certainly a talking point worth considering. Joe Biden, of course, as always, like he did with Ukraine, claims this is a humanitarian and ideological war, won't talk about ceasefire. But is it possible that there are other motivations behind his advocacy for US involvement? And if there were, wouldn't you want to know?
What are the chances of a Gaza ceasefire? None. No possibility.
None, no possibility. Forget about it. Very determined, very definitive. Now, of course, if you're a person who's pro-Israel, you'll see that as advocating for your position, and I would understand if you have deep historical, familial, religious reasons for that perspective. Of course, I would understand that. Whereas if you have connections to Palestine, or perhaps if you have an entirely different perspective for other reasons, you'll think, well, why wouldn't people be talking about peace, or at least considering peace? Here's Elon Musk on the great Lex Friedman podcast talking about other ways that the annihilation of Hamas could be interpreted and other outcomes that perhaps might be considered.
Like I said, somehow controversially, you've been a proponent of peace on Twitter, on X.
Yeah.
It's weird, isn't it, that it's become controversial even to talk about peace. Is it possible to talk about peace if you're not directly involved in this conflict? Of course, those that are inflamed, engulfed in emotion, lost in grief, bereavement and woe, I would not expect them to be able to say, well, yeah, long term, maybe, I'd understand any reaction from people that have lost their loved ones. But if you haven't lost any loved ones, perhaps we should join in creating a communion of mutually beneficial outcomes that we might discuss together.
So let me ask you about the wars going on today and to see what the path to peace could be.
If you're not going to just outright commit genocide, like against an entire people, which obviously would not be acceptable to really shouldn't be acceptable to anyone, then you're going to leave basically a lot of people alive who subsequently, hate Israel. So really the question is like, how, for every Hamas member that you kill, how many did you create?
Mm-hmm.
And if you create more than you killed, you've not succeeded. That's the real situation there. And it's safe to say that if you kill somebody's child in Gaza, you've made at least a few Hamas members who will die just to kill an Israeli. That's the situation. So. But I mean, this is one of the most contentious subjects one could possibly discuss. But I think if the goal ultimately is some sort of long-term peace, one has to look at this from the standpoint of, over time, are there more or fewer terrorists being created?
Is there a long-term goal for peace? Is it a possibility? Is it something you even want to discuss? You can see that people talk about this with a kind of weariness and exhaustion that I think comes from a good place, actually. Not wanting to offend and hurt people, but wanting to have a discussion about peace. And it's not just Elon Musk who's advancing the argument that increasing aggression is likely to create future conflicts. It's a pretty old idea, really, isn't it? Because it's like blood feuds. That's what this has always been. This is what this continues to be. And whilst, of course, I recognize that people that have different perspectives on this conflict say, no, this is unique. The other side have always been uniquely violent, displaced us, oppressed us, killed. At some point, we're going to have to try to create some cartilage, or at least an arena where we go, all right, okay, I understand that you have very, very strong views. Are we able to talk about this at all without taking sides? Or is it all you want is allegiance and alliance? Because I think that is causing more war and more weapon sales. Certainly, Hillary Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, they're all on the same side. they all agree, keep war going. That's what they think. Here's someone echoing Musk's perspective from a surprising place. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Charles Q. Brown, has expressed concern that Israel's killing of Palestinian civilians will help Hamas recruit more militants and cautioned against a long war in Gaza. Asked by reporters if the high civilian casualty rate will create more Hamas fighters, Brown said yes, very much so, and I think that's something you have to pay attention to. That's why when we talk about time, the faster you can get to a point where you stop the hostilities, you have less strife for the civilian population that turns into someone who now wants to be the next member of Hamas, he said. Brown, who replaced General Mark Milley as the top US military officer last month, said Israel's stated goal of eliminating Hamas is a large order. Mark Milley was the guy, I think, that was talking about whether or not there was a plan to engage Iran in hostilities around the time that Trump had those boxes. Remember that? No, that was a month ago. I can't think about that anymore. Weird though, isn't it, that people are saying engage Iran in hostilities a month ago. I'm not suggesting any of this is anything other than a legitimate war. What a crazy thing to say. But it is interesting that we are now more seriously talking about engaging Iran in hostilities. The Pentagon has said there are no limits on how Israel can use its US-provided weapons. Let's take a brief hiatus from this riveting and important story to give you some information that might just save your life. It's from our partners at the Wellness Company. Are you feeling drained? Are you feeling foggy lately? Are you having trouble remembering things? Is your overall energy low? We've all been a bit of a fog since 2020, and so many people are trying to dig back out of it financially, but also mentally. Mental clarity and low energy levels have almost become normalised issues in society. They want you all foggy and confused and compliant. Oh, whatever you tell me, I'll do as I'm told. That shouldn't be normal. And thanks to the Wellness Company, those issues don't have to be normal. Elevated Energy is a unique blend of natural ingredients like citicoline and CoQ10. Delicious. Designed to supercharge your cellular energy production and unlock your true mental and physical potential, which as far as you know is laying dormant somewhere within you. It's a game changer. Elevated Energy customers report increased mental clarity and energy levels. I mean, who doesn't want that in a world where you've got to stay sharp and alert? If you wish you have more energy to power you through your day, to tackle your to-do list, oppose the system and achieve your goals, head to twchealth.com/brand. Use code BRAND, BRAND, for 10% off at checkout. That's twc.health/brand, code BRAND. Unleash your cellular energy potential right now. And let's get back to some cold hard facts. 100 US government officials from the State Department and International Development Agency have signed an internal memo criticizing the White House for showing an unwillingness to de-escalate the Israel-Hamas war. It says that the Biden administration has doubled down on our unwavering military assistance to the Israeli government without clear or actionable red lines. Well, luckily Joe Biden has never done anything except be in Congress forever advocating for all sorts of things for various reasons. Let's have a look at Joe Biden's historic perspectives on this issue and see if we can detect any themes.
We stop those of us who support, as most of us do, Israel in this body, for apologizing for our support for Israel. There's no apology to be made. None. It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel.
Interesting piece of language. And also amazing to see Joe Biden so virile and terrifying.
To protect her interest in the region.
Okay, so he's just explicitly saying it's about interests in the region. Now, of course, alliances are historically and even customarily built upon a shared set of interests, so there's nothing wrong with that, unless, of course, arms are being sold across that region in ways that might be irresponsible, particularly if 57% of the world's autocracies were being sold arms by American military-industrial complex companies, and even potentially arms that were involved in the initial atrocious attack that ignited this round of the conflict, and all of those things are true, and the last thing is possible.
Israel is the single greatest strength America has in the Middle East. I always say to my friends when they say those things to you, I say, imagine our circumstance in the world were there no Israel. How many battleships would there be? How many troops would be stationed? You know, I used to say early on when I was a kid, I'd say, when I was a young senator, I'd say, if I were a Jew, I'd be a Zionist. I am a Zionist. You don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist.
There's an interesting alliance and an interesting allegiance, an allegiance that's explicitly about utility, isn't it? If you found out that someone loved you only because they were able to use you and exploit you, how valuable would that love be? I suppose in a situation that's incredibly hostile, I suppose in a time of national grief, I suppose after atrocious, unprecedented, terrible attacks, you perhaps wouldn't care, and certainly I understand that perspective. But when we're talking about prolonging and escalating these tensions, it's worth examining examining, I think, let me know what you think in the chat, whether or not the people that are supporting and prolonging these conflicts believe there are benefits beyond humanitarian and ideological ones. Because you know what I mean by that? I mean profit and power.
The security of Israel and the United States is inextricably tied. And we will never, ever, ever abandon Israel out of our own self-interest.
It literally says it's out of our own self-interest. Now, I understand that geopolitics is a complex business and it is going to involve alliances, but I wonder when people question Joe Biden's sanity, credibility, his appetite for war, his willingness to advocate for escalating conflicts, for example, in the Ukraine and Russia war, whether or not the same analytic can be applied. This is a genuine question because, as I continually say to you, I feel that our role here is to create a space where we might look with some degree of sanguinity at a complex, hostile, escalating situation that has caused so much pain and has the capacity clearly to generate so much more. If any aspect of this is about geopolitical objectives of dominion and profit, you'd want that taken out pretty quickly so you could perhaps then deal with it for its own internal complexity. Would you? Or do you just think throw everything at this until it just destroys everybody? I don't know. It seems to me worth considering. 8 months before the Biden administration approved a massive arms deal for Israel amid its war in Gaza, President Joe Biden signed a directive prohibiting such deals for countries likely to use the weapons to attack civilian targets or direct violence against children. That's interesting that it's not subject to the same directives. Is that interesting? The Biden administration's arms transfer decision and its concurrent push for billions of dollars of additional arms sales to Israel came less than a year after Biden issued a formal order to federal agencies forbidding weapons transfers to countries where it is more likely than not that the weapons will be used to engage in attacks intentionally directed against civilian objects or civilians or used to commit serious acts of violence against children. That seems like a reasonable principle, and when principles start to erode, like free speech being one of the principles now, that you can see, for example, that on the left, where the left were quite happy about censorship issues when it involved right-wing talking points, the left now, hey, you're censoring pro-Palestinian voices. This is what happens when there are no clear principles. If there is a principle, don't bomb civilian targets, we're not going to sell weapons to people that might bomb civilian targets or arm nations that might use them against civilian targets, I guess you have to recognize that that isn't a real principle. No, we do that. We do that. And I know what the arguments are because I'm trying my best to listen to all the variety of complex views. If Hamas are in civilian places, what choice do you have? I understand, I've heard it, like I recognize all of it. It's actually increasingly difficult with such a ossified polemical environment to even find the cracks through which the light of love can even be tentatively shone. Children, love, forgiveness, of course it's terrible. All of the events are terrible. Deaths on both sides are terrible. Anyone being killed for its terrorist attacks or drone strikes, and whether it's this war or other wars, or were people saying that, al-Assad in Syria is killing hundreds and thousands of people in civil wars across that. All of it's wrong. All of it's wrong. What are we going to do? Is what we're avoiding saying here is we are at our limit now as humans. There is no more love. There are no more ideas. Our only trajectory of progression is technology. There is nothing spiritually to be learned. We're going to just find a side and kill one another. Is that it? Because that's sometimes what it sounds like to me. I don't hear people. All I hear is people like, you can't call it two sides when one's in an open prison, or how dare you deny Israel's right. I'm like, I don't want either of those positions because those positions seem really, really well occupied, forgive the use of that word. And is it possible for us to look at a way that we might end this? Is it possible? And both sides almost scream no simultaneously. And I start to think, actually, well, you agree on so much. Okay, so let's tiptoe a little further into this nightmare. Is anyone profiting from this conflict? The New York Times recently reported, among other things, Middle East war adds to surge in international arms sales. The conflict in Gaza, Ukraine and beyond may be causing immense and unconscionable human suffering, but they are also boosting the bottom lines of the world's arms manufacturers. Is this something we want to address at some point? There was a time when such weapons sales at least sparked talk of the merchants of death or of war profiteers. Now, however, is distinctly not that time, given the treatment of the industry by the mainstream media and the Washington establishment, as well as the nature of current conflicts. Mind you, the American arms industry already dominates the international market in a staggering fashion, controlling 45% of all such sales globally, a gap only likely to grow more extreme in the rush to further arm allies in Europe and the Middle East in the context of the ongoing wars in those regions. In short, the military-industrial complex is riding high, with revenues pouring in and accolades emanating from the top political levels in Washington. So, a psychological global environment where an end to war, and I don't just mean this current war in Gaza, I mean war, that three-letter word, is unconscionable and unthinkable. The United States of America requires war. The military-industrial complex is so powerful, so influential, and requires, in order to sustain itself, endless war. So as soon as you start talking about, is it possible that we should stop funding this conflict between Ukraine and Russia? When can we start talking about a diplomatic resolution to this situation that could potentially displace millions of people, create more terrorism, a migration crisis, death, horror, terror? It's unthinkable. Well, we just can't discuss it because it's impolite. It's actually wrong to even talk about that. I don't trust them. They benefit too much from sustained ongoing war. Raytheon CEO Gregory Hayes acknowledged recently that supplying Ukraine alone would yield billions in revenues over the coming years with a profit margin of 10 to 12%. Beyond such direct profits, there's a larger issue here. The way this country's arms lobby is using war to argue for a variety of favourable actions that include less restrictive multi-year contracts, reductions in protections against price gouging, faster approval of foreign sales, and the construction of new weapons plants. And keep in mind that all this is happening as a soaring Pentagon budget threatens to hit an astonishing $1 trillion within the next few years. It's a bit like the pandemic period. A crisis occurs. The crisis requires expenditure. The crisis will not permit analysis. Contracts are awarded, now I'm speaking in the UK, for Moderna in particular, that reach years into the future, 10-year-long contracts. The crisis is bewildering. The crisis is supposed to bewilder. There are many people who I wouldn't even ask, could you look at this plainly after the terrible attacks on October the 7th? Could you look at this terribly while your family members are in Gaza? I wouldn't expect that of anyone, but unless you are in that situation, perhaps you can bear in mind the general strategy of the establishment elites when it comes to the exploitation of crisis. Do you think this crisis is somehow different and isn't being exploited? This is the one true ideological crisis. Over the years, far from being a reliable arsenal of democracy, American arms manufacturers have often helped undermine democracy globally while enabling ever greater repression and conflict, a fact largely ignored in recent mainstream coverage of the industry. For example, a 2022 report for the Quincy Institute revealed of the 46 then active conflicts globally, 34 involved one or more parties armed by the United States. One or more. Sometimes they were arming both sides of a conflict. So that's nearly all, like 3/4 of the 46 global conflicts, one or more side were being armed by the United States. So is it in each one of these wars? I really believe in, just can you fill the word in after? I really believe in right to have this war. If we didn't support our allies in, then that would be unthinkable. This war is unique from other wars, so that's why we have to perpetuate until we get rid of all, put terrorists, freedom fighters, whatever, have been annihilated. Again, I recognize that with the situation in the Middle East, it's uniquely complex and emotions are understandably very, very high, but so are profits. In some cases, American arms supplies were modest, but in many other conflicts, such weaponry was central to the military capabilities of one or more of the warring parties. Nor do such weapon sales promote democracy over autocracy, a watchword of the Biden administration's approach to foreign policy. In 2021, the most recent year for which full statistics are available, the US armed 31 nations that Freedom House, a non-profit that tracks global trends in democracy, political freedom and human rights, designated as not free. They're not free. Are you free or not free? Boo, not free. The most egregious recent example in which the American arms industry is distinctly culpable when it comes to staggering numbers of civilian deaths will be the Saudi Arabian United Arab Emirates-led coalition intervention into Yemen, which began in March 2015 and has yet to truly end. Between bombing, fighting on the ground, and the impact of that blockade, there have been nearly 400,000 casualties. Now that does beg the question, why are these wars not regarded in the same way as this one? Clearly there are people that oppose or support either aspect of this conflict for reasons that are difficult to fully understand, because 400,000 people have died in this conflict, and what are they? They're military casualties. These people don't matter in some kind of way. It's extraordinary. We've really got a lot to learn. Certainly I feel like I have. Saudi airstrikes using American-produced planes and weaponry caused the bulk of civilian deaths from military action. Bombs provided by Raytheon and Lockheed Martin were routinely used to target civilians, destroying residential neighbourhoods, factories, hospitals, a wedding, and even a school bus. You should be able to hear something like that and not want to go, where was that? It was in this region. oh, well, in that case, it's wrong. Like, you should be able to just hear it and go, yeah, that's just not right. I mean, we all know what the world is. We've all been alive a while, haven't we? So it's like, okay, yeah, I get it. War is terrible. These conflicts are awful. But that shouldn't be the end of the idea. That should be, so now we're going to find ways of solving these complex problems in the same way as we would as if our lives depended on it, because they do. And if you can't solve them, maybe don't make them worse. When questioned about whether they feel any responsibility for how their weapons have been used, arms companies generally pose as passive bystanders. Well, you know, I was just passively standing by and I noticed over there some bombings were happening, and over there I didn't barely really do anything. Where did they get those weapons? Oh, well, we sold those weapons to them. But other than that, I've been very passive and just standing by, really. Passive bystanders arguing that all they're doing is following policies made in Washington. That's what military-industrial complex means. The arms companies go Washington, and Washington, I mean, they just say whatever they need to say to do whatever they're going to do, like with any issue. Extraordinary. Raytheon simply stated that its sales of precision-guided munitions to Saudi Arabia have been and remain in compliance with US law. Wow. So governments are more powerful than corporations then, unless those corporations are able to somehow puppet governments. The list of major human rights abusers that receive US-supplied weaponry is long and includes, but isn't faintly limited to, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Egypt, Turkey, Nigeria, and the Philippines. Such sales can have devastating human consequences. They also support regimes that all too often destabilize their regions and risk embroiling the United States directly in conflicts. US-supplied arms also far too regularly fall into the hands of Washington's adversaries. As an example, consider the way that the UAE transferred small arms and armored vehicles produced by American weapons makers to extremist militias in Yemen, with no apparent consequences, even though such acts clearly violate American arms export laws. Sometimes recipients of such weaponry even end up fighting each other, as when Turkey used US-supplied F-16s in 2019 to bomb US-backed Syrian forces involved in the fight against Islamic State terrorists. It's like a weird, mad game. You might as well have just blown them up in the factory. But who's benefiting from this? Oh no, I get it. Such examples underscore the need to scrutinise US arms exports far more carefully. Instead, the arms industry has promoted an increasingly streamlined process of approval of such weapon sales, campaigning for numerous measures that would make it even easier to arm foreign regimes, regardless of their human rights records or support for the interests Washington theoretically promotes. They want to make it even easier than it is now, even though the majority of conflicts appear to own at least some American armament, and Pentagon budgets are moving towards $1 trillion a year. What they're obviously advocating for is an escalation. So the escalation or lack of ceasefire in one conflict, whether you mean Ukraine, Russia, or Israel and Hamas by that, that's consistent with a policy and a business model that requires ongoing growth and escalation. Yes, your tax dollars are being squandered in the rush to build and sell ever more weaponry abroad. Worse yet, for every arms transfer that serves a legitimate defensive purpose, there's another, not to say others, that fuels conflicts and repression, while only increasing the risk that as the giant weapons corporations and their executives make fortunes, this country will become embroiled in more costly foreign conflicts. Rather than romanticising the military-industrial complex, isn't it time to place it under greater democratic control? After all, so many lives depend on it. I suppose what's being said there is that there could be greater regulation of the military-industrial complex. Some ways that could take place is maybe if they weren't able to donate to political parties, maybe if people in Congress weren't able to own stocks and shares in them, maybe if the American public, and indeed the public of any nation, were able to vote about how arms are allocated and how wars are funded, whether or not you believe in the building of American infrastructure, schools, hospitals, roads, whatever's important in your district. All those things are abstract. They're off the agenda. We live in an age of austerity, except for when it comes for war. There, we live in an age of abundance, when there's always enough of your taxpayer dollars for any conflict. I've told you before, when it comes to this complex conflict, I only want to advocate for the best outcome for everyone involved, because there is no good outcome for one side. There isn't one. It will escalate in one way or another. The only organisations that benefit from ongoing escalating unscrutinised war are the military-industrial complex. And for that to happen, it requires a legacy media that continually conveys their perspective, or whatever perspective is desired. Washington ultimately being financially tied to the military-industrial complex, or being a vital component of it, so connected to it, it's impossible to see the join. And our willingness to tolerate war around the world as just a necessary and ordinary part of everyday life. Is it possible that globalism has to come to a kind of end, that we have to now recognize that we live in smaller communities, maybe a nation, maybe a state or a county or a town or a village. Maybe we have to find ways of bringing power as close to the people affected by it as possible, so that these global entities can't conduct nefarious missions around the world, finding whatever narrative is required to perpetuate it without ever being duly accountable. But that's just what I think. Why don't you let me know what you think in the comments and the chat below? If you enjoyed this show, we stream live every day at these times. Join us over on Rumble. In the meantime, if you can, stay free. Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to see more uncensored content where free speech can flourish, join our live stream. Click the link right here to watch the next video if you want to, or become a member of a growing movement. Download the Rumble app and you'll be informed every time we make a new piece of content. Stay free.